It all began with a rumour. Whispers spread across the hills of Canaan, bouncing from shepherd to merchant to city guard. The Israelites were on the move again. These weren't just wandering nomads anymore. Under their new leader Joshua, they had become a force of nature, unstoppable, unpredictable, and backed by a God who seemed to specialise in impossible victories. Everyone had heard about Jericho. That city had walls so thick you could race chariots on top of them, walls that had stood for generations, laughing at the idea of ever falling. And yet, after 7 days of Israel marching round and blowing trumpets, Jericho's walls collapsed like a badly stacked pile of clay jars. No siege engines, no battering rams, just music, shouting, and divine demolition. Other cities fell soon after, each story more unbelievable than the last. People began to tremble at the mention of Joshua's name, and then came the real shocker. Gibeon, a powerful city with strong warriors, didn't fight Israel. Instead, they pulled off the ultimate diplomatic hustle. They pretended to be from a faraway land, wore mouldy bread as props, and begged Joshua for a peace treaty. Joshua agreed. Later, when he realized he'd been tricked, it was too late. The oath had been sworn. Israel and Gibeon were allies now. This was like finding out your neighbour who always borrowed your tools and never returned them, suddenly joined your side in battle. Awkward, but useful. The rest of Canaan, however, was furious, especially Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem. He gathered 4 other kings, Hoam of Hebron, Piram of Jarmuth, Japhia of Lachish, and Debir of Eglon. Together they formed the 5-king alliance, an ancient justice league of villains, except without the capes. Gibeon betrayed us, they seethed. If they're siding with Israel, then they must fall first. And so the 5 kings marched their armies to punish Gibeon. The Gibeonites, realizing they were about to be pulverized, sent word to Joshua. "Hey, remember that treaty? Yeah, we're cashing in, please hurry." Joshua could have said, "Serves you right for tricking us," but he didn't. He honoured the alliance. Overnight he rallied his troops and marched from Gilgal to Gibeon. Picture thousands of sandals stomping through the dark, men muttering about sore feet and wondering if this was all worth it. Joshua himself strode at the front, eyes fixed on the horizon. He knew this wasn't just about Gibeon. It was about showing the whole region that Israel's God was in control. At dawn, they struck. The Amorite coalition expected an easy victory over Gibeon. Instead, they found themselves ambushed by an army they hadn't planned on facing. Israel came crashing down the hills like a tidal wave of spears and shouts. Panic erupted. The Amorites broke ranks, scattering in every direction. But God wasn't done yet. As they fled, hailstones the size of melons came hurtling from the sky. Soldiers looked up just in time to get bonked on the head by ice that made helmets useless. The Bible says more men died from the hail than from Israelite swords. Imagine that. Training for battle your whole life, only to be knocked out by heavenly hail. Some Amorite soldier probably looked up and yelled, "Really? This is how I go out?" Still, the battle wasn't over. Joshua's army was pushing forward, but the sun was climbing high, and he knew what that meant. Time was slipping away. In ancient warfare, nightfall usually ended the fight. Armies regrouped, survivors escaped, and opportunities were lost. Joshua didn't want the Amorites slinking away under cover of darkness. He wanted a total, decisive victory. So he prayed, and not just any prayer, the boldest, most audacious prayer you can imagine. Standing in front of his exhausted soldiers, with sweat dripping into his beard, Joshua looked up and shouted, "Sun, stand still over Gibeon, moon, stop in the valley of Ajalon." Can you picture the soldiers' faces? Some probably thought, did he just yell at the sky? Is he okay? Others might have laughed nervously. Well, points for creativity. But then, silence. The battlefield froze. Not the soldiers, not the hail, but the heavens themselves. The sun stopped moving. The shadows refused to shift. The day stretched unnaturally long, like someone had hit pause on the universe. For the Amorites, it was a nightmare. They had hoped to escape into nightfall, but night never came. Hour after hour, daylight refused to end, and with it came Israel's relentless pursuit. For the Israelites, it was exhausting but exhilarating. "Guess we're pulling a double shift," one soldier muttered, while another shouted, "Keep going! The sun's on our side." Somewhere, a rooster crowed non-stop, utterly confused about what time it was. And so the slaughter continued. The Amorites ran, stumbled, hid and died, under sword, under hail, under the relentless gaze of a frozen sun. By the time the day was finally over, the 5 kings themselves had fled and hidden in a cave. But Joshua wasn't about to let them escape. He ordered the cave sealed with stones and guards. Later, he dragged them out, executed them, and hung their bodies as warnings on trees until evening. Only then were they taken down and thrown back into the cave. It was brutal. It was decisive. It was unforgettable. The book of Joshua sums it up like this. There has never been a day like it before or since, a day when the Lord listened to a human being. Surely the Lord was fighting for Israel, and that's the story. The daytime itself bent for a man's prayer, the day the sun stood still. But imagine being there. Imagine being a farmer watching your sundial stubbornly refuse to move. Imagine being a child, yawning because it felt like bedtime but the sky insisted it was still noon. Imagine being a soldier, swinging your sword for what felt like 2 days straight. For everyone alive then, it wasn't just a battle. It was a cosmic event, a day when the laws of nature themselves took a knee before the God of Israel. The battlefield was chaos. Imagine dust clouds so thick you could barely see your own shield, men shouting over the clash of bronze against bronze, and the sound of hailstones whistling through the air like a heavenly drumbeat. Horses reared, soldiers slipped on blood-slick ground, and the Amorite alliance, once confident in their numbers, dissolved into panicked fragments. Joshua, standing tall amid the storm, was a commander transformed. He had already marched through the night without rest, led a surprise assault at dawn, and now he was pushing his men to fight in a day that simply refused to end. If coffee had existed back then, the Israelites would have needed barrels of it. Instead, they fought on adrenaline, faith, and the slightly unnerving realization that their general had literally yelled at the sun and it listened. The Amorite soldiers, on the other hand, were unravelling fast. One survivor sprinted toward the trees, muttering, "I don't get paid enough for this." Another tripped over a fallen comrade and groaned, "Why couldn't I have joined the Philistines? They have nicer helmets." Meanwhile, the hail kept falling, but only on them. The Israelites looked up, blinking, as massive chunks of ice zipped past their heads and clocked Amorites square in the face. It was like the world's deadliest game of dodgeball, and the Israelites were somehow on the safe team. Somewhere in heaven, an angel with excellent aim was probably grinning. As the battle raged, Joshua's prayer became the talk of the camp. Soldiers whispered to each other as they fought. "Did you hear him? Yeah, he told the sun to stop. And it did. Should we be worried about what he'll say next? Like, hey stars, do a backflip?" The longer the sun stayed frozen, the stranger it felt. Time was stretched thin, like someone had taken a normal day and pulled it like taffy. Farmers in distant villages stared at their sundials, scratching their heads. Roosters crowed until they were hoarse. Children whined. But isn't it bedtime already? Only to be told, apparently not. Back on the battlefield, the Amorites fled westward down the slopes toward the valley roads that led away from Gibeon. Israel pursued with relentless ferocity. Every hill became a choke point, every stream a trap. Wherever they ran, the Israelites were there, swords gleaming in the unending sun. Finally word came. The 5 kings themselves, Adoni-Zedek, Hoham, Piram, Japhia and Debir, had abandoned their troops and hidden inside a cave near Makkedah. Cowards! When Joshua heard this, he didn't rush in immediately. He was too busy securing the victory. "Roll large stones over the mouth of the cave," he ordered, "and post guards. Don't waste men chasing them now. We'll deal with the kings later. Keep fighting the army first." It was a brilliant move. The kings, trapped in darkness, sat in their rocky prison while their soldiers were cut to pieces outside. They could hear the faint echoes of battle, the screams, the pounding of hail. Maybe one king muttered, "So, anyone bring cards?" Another probably sat in the corner muttering, "He talked to the sun." The sun! We never had a chance. When the dust of battle finally began to settle, Israel had routed the Amorite coalition. Survivors scattered into fortified cities, but the bulk of the army lay in heaps across the valley roads. The Israelites gathered, breathing hard, armour smeared with dust and blood, sandals worn from endless pursuit. And then Joshua turned his attention to the cave. "Bring them out," he commanded. The stones were rolled away. The 5 kings stumbled into the light, blinking like owls dragged out at noon, which ironically still seemed to be noon. Their robes were torn, their crowns missing, their faces pale. These were rulers who once strutted in palaces and commanded armies, now reduced to trembling captives standing before the man who had literally commanded the heavens. Joshua didn't just execute them right away. First he staged a lesson. He called his commanders forward and said, "Come here and put your feet on the necks of these kings." Awkward moment for the kings. The commanders obeyed, pressing their sandaled feet onto the necks of the fallen rulers. Joshua declared, "Don't be afraid. Don't be discouraged. Be strong and courageous. This is what the Lord will do to all the enemies you fight." It wasn't just about humiliating the kings. It was about reminding Israel that victory wasn't theirs by luck or numbers. It was theirs because God fought for them. The commanders looked at each other, maybe suppressing grins, maybe marvelling at the weight of what they were part of. The kings, meanwhile, probably wished the sun would set already, just so they wouldn't have to endure this public disgrace any longer. Then came the executions. Joshua struck them down and hung their bodies on 5 trees, where they dangled as grisly warnings until evening finally arrived. The Israelites stood guard, watching the strange day finally slide into twilight, as if the universe sighed and said, "Okay, time to move again." At sunset, the bodies were taken down and thrown back into the cave where they had hidden. Large stones sealed the entrance once more, a permanent tomb for the would-be alliance. And just like that, the campaign rolled on. Joshua wasn't content with a single victory. With the 5 kings gone, their cities lay vulnerable, and Israel struck them one by one like dominoes toppling. Makkedah fell first, then Libnah, then Lachish, Eglon, Hebron, and Debir. Each city became another line in the growing legend of Joshua's conquests. But none of those later battles ever matched the sheer, jaw-dropping spectacle of the day the sun stood still. That story spread like wildfire, retold around campfires, whispered in marketplaces, and etched into the memory of a nation. It wasn't just a battle. It was the daytime itself bent at the request of a man. Generations later, kids probably asked their grandfathers, "What was it like? Did it feel weird?" And the old men would lean back, eyes distant, and say, "Son, you've never seen a day so long in your life. We fought and fought, and when we thought the night was near, the sun just stared back at us, frozen in the sky. It was as if God himself wanted to watch the whole thing." And the child, wide-eyed, would whisper, "Wow! Did you win?" The old man would chuckle, "Oh yes, we won. We won so hard the sun had to wait for us to finish." As night finally crept across the land, Israel's camp breathed a collective sigh of relief. Torches flickered, fires crackled, and men slumped against their shields, too tired to even untie their sandals. It had been a day unlike any other, a day so long it felt like 2 stitched together. Joshua himself stood quietly apart, staring at the horizon where the sun had at last agreed to move. The battle was won, the kings were dead, but he knew this wasn't just another victory. This was a story that would echo for centuries. Some soldiers muttered among themselves, half joking, half serious, "Do you think Joshua can do that again?" I hope not. My arms are going to fall off. I just want to know what time it is. Is it still the same Tuesday, or did we skip to Wednesday? The exhaustion was bone deep, but so was the wonder. Every man knew he'd been part of something cosmic. They hadn't just fought a war, they had lived through a miracle, and that miracle had ripple effects. The cities of Canaan heard the news, and fear spread like wildfire. This story wasn't just that Israel had beaten the 5 kings. Armies win and lose battles all the time. The story was that the God of Israel had bent the heavens to grant them victory. Imagine hearing that your neighbour's army has divine artillery, cosmic time control, and weather manipulation on their side. Suddenly, fighting them didn't sound so appealing. But for Israel, the story wasn't just about fear, it was about faith. They had marched all night, fought all day, and seen the sky itself obey a prayer. If God could freeze the sun, what couldn't he do? Still, there was humour in the retelling. Around the campfires, soldiers laughed at the strangeness of it all. Remember when that hailstone flattened 3 guys in a row, one would say. And remember the look on King Adoni-Zedek's face when he got dragged out of that cave? Another would chuckle. I swear, said a weary fighter, if Joshua tells the sun to stand still again, I'm retiring. Somewhere in Gibeon, families who had once feared Israel now whispered in awe, thank God we made that treaty. Best decision ever. Mouldy bread for the win. For the Amorite survivors, the tale was bitter. Imagine returning home after fleeing the battle, collapsing in exhaustion, and being asked, what happened? How do you even explain it? Well, first the Israelites surprised us. Then the sky dropped ice bombs. Then the sun refused to set. Then our kings hid in a cave and got stomped on. Other than that, it was a normal Tuesday. Generations later, storytellers would still embellish the details. Some swore the sun blazed brighter, others that the air itself felt heavy, like the world was holding its breath. Poets wrote verses about the long day. Children acted it out in games. Scholars debated how it happened. But ordinary people just shook their heads and said, all I know is the sun didn't move, and Israel won. For Joshua, though, it wasn't about spectacle, it was about obedience. He hadn't asked the sun to stop just to show off. He had prayed boldly because he trusted God's promise to deliver the land. And that trust had been rewarded in a way no one could forget. The book of Joshua records it simply. There has never been a day like it before or since, a day when the Lord listened to a human being. Surely the Lord was fighting for Israel. No exaggeration needed, and maybe that's the real power of the story. Not just that the sun stood still, but that heaven bent low to hear the voice of a man. It was a partnership between divine power and human faith, a moment when prayer moved not just hearts but the cosmos. Picture it one last time. A battlefield stretched under a frozen sky, shadows stuck in place, hailstones littering the ground, and soldiers squinting upward at a sun that refused to budge. The clash of steel, the cries of victory, the groans of defeat, all unfolding under the strangest, longest, most legendary day in human history. And when the night finally came, it carried with it a silence that felt holy. The soldiers slept. The earth rested. The sun, having stood still long enough, slipped gently below the horizon as if to say, all right, you had your miracle. Now let time run again. The war would continue, cities would fall, victories and defeats would still come, but nothing would ever compare to that day. The day Joshua prayed and the universe listened. The day the sun itself obeyed. The day time bowed to the will of God.